I'll give the session to Andrew. By the way, if you want to ask any questions, you can either ask them at the end, which I'd prefer, or type them into the chat, and I'll ask them on your behalf after Andrew has finished. Thank you.
All right. Well, first and foremost, hello, everybody. As announced, I'm Andrew Mitchell. Thanks to Subes and also for the introduction from Rick. I also would like to thank my co-authors, Mohammed Mazar from Nottingham Trent University, Birgit Painter, and Professor Mark Lemon from IESD. I would also like to thank Mohammed for presenting the slides, for developing the slides on our behalf. And also, especially, I'd like to thank everybody who's attending today, whether you're presenting or attending. Despite the best efforts from Subes, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be having a conference. So thank you very much for your participation today. I don't know if you can see my camera or not, but if you can, I'm going to switch it off for bandwidth purposes, and then I'll just do the presentation.
Do you want to maximize the slides, Andrew?
I'll try. I'm a little cautious that I'm going to get frozen considering my previous experience. So bear with me a second. How's that? Does that work?
Not yet. No. No. Okay. Carry on.
Okay. Can you see the maximized slides, Rick?
No, they're still showing in the other format.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that format. At least that's safe, and we can just move on anyway. Okay. Smart city development is a strategy to address problems caused by rapid urbanization and socioeconomic challenges. So while the notion of a smart city is ubiquitous, this paper argues that what is needed is not a city where managerial responsibilities have been handed over to ICT, but rather to conceptualize the city as an ecosystem. This perspective posits that the city is a complex adaptive system, a cognitive system, which adaptively learns via urban planners and managers. With reference to the COVID-19 pandemic and the UK response thereto, we recognize various constraints to human judgment and decision-making under complex conditions, and advocate the contribution of in silico simulations and controlled experiments to test future threats and response scenarios. These facilitate identifying unsustainable future trajectories and the development of alternative strategic opportunities to foster building systemic resilience in anticipating future shocks, and that doing so is an ethical necessity to conserve the viability of future city systems. In their most recent report, the UK's National Audit Office observed that the global COVID-19 pandemic had, quote, stress-tested the government's ability to deal with unforeseen events, end quote, and emphasized that the government needed a systematic plan for dealing with emergencies and the ability to learn at speed. The recent pandemic highlights but one example of large-scale and rapidly evolving situations that governments, managers, and planners in cities must respond to. Given that the even more conservative scenarios in recent IPCC reports, the impacts of climate change will be nothing less than critical, large-scale, dynamic, and probably irreversible, and we are already seeing those in the northwestern region of the Americas. The sole advantage the government, along with others, with governance and planning responsibility involving large numbers of people's welfare, including city managers and planners, have with respect to climate change, which they did not have with the pandemic, is that we have been very much aware of the former and still do have time to plan for it. Nevertheless, how the government responded to the pandemic, both during and after the crisis, serves as an illustration of what is required in managing for emergencies. Despite various definitions, the smart city is still a fuzzy concept, with an over-reliance on technological interventions. In this paper, we relocate the discussion of the city as a spatial dynamic assemblage of people, governance, technology, economics, and nature, and interrogate the notion of the smart city and its goodness of fit to respond to challenges that are foreseen, such as climate change, and those which catch us by surprise, such as a global pandemic. In particular, we problematize the notion of smart cities as those which simply hand over managerial responsibility and functions to computer-assisted technology, and develop the argument that, conceptually and practically, we need to move beyond this notion to construe urban conurbations as ecosystems. This shift in emphasis explicitly recognizes that cities converge organisms and inorganic materials within the same structurally coupled spatiotemporal domains. It enables us to scaffold the argument in favor of positing cities as complex adaptive systems, much in the way that we conceive of ecosystems as dynamic and complex. In making the case for this qualitative shift, we propose that rather than valorizing smart cities, we need to hold the bar higher and pitch instead for cognitive cities. In doing so, we propose that the city, as a complex adaptive system, is itself structurally coupled with its larger environment, its niche, with which it must successfully conserve its organization in order to persist and endure over time. It is only by doing so, by expanding our conceptual framework, that we can begin to systematically plan for emergencies, both known and unknown, and to lock in functional redundancy for cities as systems to absorb shocks without changing state conditions. We conclude this brief paper by exploring the application to which in silico experiments and simulations can be recruited for stress testing the city's system's adaptive capacities and to enhance the scope for strategic planning to anticipate and build in systemic resilience for future shocks. Therefore, this can help realize the ambition of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, which calls for making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Urban migration and settlement dynamics have long been a phenomenon of research interest among geographers, urban planners, and sociologists. With increasing concerns about human impacts on local and global ecosystems, and the emergence of sustainability and sustainable development as determinants of policy and regulatory frameworks, urban configurations have attracted further interest among researchers in the evaluation of how such conurbations are and can be better positioned to these frameworks. As cities have increased in both size and complexity, some have been classified as global cities, a term which describes their position as hubs within a transnational network, linking economic and social transactions with other cities across the world. As with all complex systems, bounding discrete limit points which demarcate the boundaries of one system from the beginning of another is arbitrary, and this applies not only to so-called global cities, but also to urban conurbations with rich and multi-dimensional linkages to peri-urban and rural hinterlands. Rather than thinking of cities as places, then, it becomes more meaningful to conceptualize cities as regions of intensification that converge land use and cover and population densities along with their emergent infrastructures. Consequently, the city and its complex web of stocks and flows is more appropriately described as a metabolic system, an ecosystem configuration converging human and inorganic materials. Cities are ecosystems which not only favor humans, but also support a vast array of non-human organisms, from rats and insects to urbanized wildlife and bacteria and virus colonies moving along a multiplicity of nutrient and disease vectors. That is to say, in cities, as humans, we are entangled in the multi-scalar and complex networks of relations with technology, non-human organisms, and inorganic materials. The behavior of a system is determined by its structure, its feedback loops, and the flows and stocks, and the emergent non-linearities of its interacting components. Conceptualizing cities as complex systems is an approach that is increasingly being endorsed, along with the use of agent-based modeling methods to interrogate a range of phenomena, from the structure of communities to the potential failure risk of power systems. Modeling cities as adaptive favors a shift towards preparing to respond to future challenges, rather than reacting to them once they are underway. This exposes a significant quandary for those attempting to run controlled experiments and scenario forecasting to anticipate what is more probable and distinguish this from what is less probable, and to incorporate data relevant to exploring predicted outcomes and response options. To effectively run simulations anticipating future scenarios, modelers must not only balance events that are high impact and high probability, but also those that are high impact with a low or even unknown probability of occurring. In other words, balancing uncertainty and surprise. All these judgments take place as cognitive acts and are effectively expressions of the mental models recruited by the systems analysts. And herein lies the challenge. If the analyst's mental model excludes some scenarios, this becomes a modeling blind spot. One does not know what one does not know. The challenge with complexity is that it compels us to realize that we are all passengers on an aircraft. We must not only fly, but redesign in flight. And human cognition struggles with complex recursive operations. There are a number of well-documented reasons for this, which have been described in terms of flawed cognitive models and mental maps. As Jay Forrester notes, The mental model is fuzzy, it is incomplete, it is imprecisely stated. Furthermore, within one individual, the mental model changes with time and even during the flow of a single conversation. But this is not a problem that is easily resolved through assembling a team of modelers. One's mental model is, on one hand, individual and unique, but on the other is socially structured and determined, in part due to the cognitive architecture and shared heuristics with which we as humans conserve our autonomy as a species. Indeed, an argument can be made that posits the Anthropocene as a limit point to both human progress and to human cognition, exposing the folly of notions of infinite economic growth and ignoring complexity in favor of simple linear models. In addition to such limitations associated with mental models, humans are also notoriously poor at making decisions and judgments that are free of biases. Moreover, we struggle to understand causal relations and express a strong tendency to insist on the validity of initial judgments despite evidence to the contrary. The UK government's response to the global pandemic keenly illustrates this tendency. By the early part of 2020, when the pandemic was identified as a worldwide health crisis by the World Health Organization, the UK had already been engaged in emergency health planning for a number of years. All planning scenarios to that point had, however, been based on the transmission models of the common flu, and despite a lack of evidence to support similarities in transmission vectors between the two viruses, the UK government responded to the new threat in the same ways as it had modelled its responses to a virus with which it was already familiar. Responding to the wrong virus exemplifies how we tend to constrain responses to the novel by insisting on applying responses to which we are already familiar, even if there is no alignment between the two. This response error, in conjunction with a series of politically driven economic strategies, which weakened the UK's infrastructure and the healthcare system in particular, led to the UK finding itself unable to adequately respond to the novel emergent threat. There is a large and growing body of research into judgment and decision-making, which repeatedly indicates the influence of a range of cognitive limitations. These include defensive routines, selective attention, inability to track time lags between causal chains, differences of spatial scales, and confirmation biases, along with a long list of heuristics. All of these occlude and distort the capacity for human cognition to deal effectively with complex and dynamic phenomena. This is not to propose that modelling should not be used to anticipate future scenarios. On the contrary, if anything, it actually makes the case for using scenario modelling and simulations to experiment with and to explore future and novel threats and to plan strategic adaptive responses. Indeed, modelling has been very successful in anticipating public health epidemics and impacts and appropriate response options. But what it does mean is that we need to be mindful that the models we rely on are limited by human cognition, the ways that we make sense of the world and deal with complexity, and to factor that into the learning processes. We also need to recognize the potential of such models to generate unforeseen and/or unforeseeable futures, rather than testing how likely our own diverse perceptions of that future might be. In other words, how can we learn from those futures to make informed judgments about their likelihood, potential responses, and what capital needs to be held in reserve, as in being redundant, to respond to or to avoid them. Given the foregoing, how can city managers and planners exploit the advantages of using in silico computational scenario planning while also avoiding the biases of mental models and cognitive heuristics to forecast and promote an appropriate alignment between problem definition and adaptive response sets? The obvious answer is to factor a recognition of these biases into the construction of models. This not only means that urban planners are trained in ways of working within data-rich environments and in silico models for anticipating and dealing with the impact of a sudden onset catastrophe, such as, for example, an earthquake in the center of a city. Arguably, this is already a well-established part of an urban planner's toolkit. But what it also means is that modelers and urban planners must be aware of how bodies, including our embodied cognition, are entangled with culture, utterances, and ecologies. To briefly explore this point further, this requires urban planners and modelers to problematize and attend to how bodies are produced through our engagements, our entanglements with technologies and smart cities, just as capitalism turns our bodies into working machines. When cognition is construed less as the transmission and interpretation of information, but extended biologically to the history of successive adaptations to the organism's niche as a unit of survival, then learning is the recognition that we, as humans, change the environments within which we persist as much as those environments change us in a reciprocal and mutual influence of coupling. We are, in effect, at the wave front of change, always in the process of becoming other as we engage in the reciprocal influence of adaptations with an environment we are changing through our own successive adaptations. The implications of this, then, are that we should be less concerned with promoting sustainable cities and communities, such as the SDG 11, but perhaps be seeking to explore how we can avoid those futures which are themselves unsustainable. This is to make explicit that we cannot necessarily know what does work, but we can certainly anticipate what does not work. We can agree, for example, that we can no longer permit the profligate use of fossil fuels due to increasing carbon emissions and changing climate. We can agree that we can no longer support the use of disposable plastics, nor can we support the unfettered destruction of habitats and biomes and the laying to waste of entire ecosystems and the biodiversity which characterizes them. To implement this, from the perspective of cognitive cities at least, is to recognize that we are always in the process of becoming other. Our adaptive futures have yet to be realized, but the future is already underway. One option for ensuring that future adaptive pathways do not become unsustainable is for cognitive cities to adopt strategic decision support functions. These need to be supplemented by a dialogue decision process, which is a disciplined series of structured dialogues between two groups responsible for reaching a decision and implementing the resulting action plan, a process which helps to build consensus around those actions to take. This dialogical process both is informed by and informs critical simulations and models. This proposal is thus a far cry from the model of smart cities, which tends to rely on ICT and artificial intelligence for routine managerial responsibilities. Instead, this proposal argues to include computational resources for the simulation and modeling of scenarios in order to run controlled and reversible experiments, modify and update inputs and novel influences and relationships, and to generate multiple outcomes. Through a dialogical process of engagement and an application of the precautionary principle, these scenarios can feed forward into policy and planning as a way of learning from a range of futures, which yield a range of possible typologies for interventions. Moreover, doing so does not require implementation in vivo, given spatial poverty and the limits to what can be developed from scratch in a city that is already live. In this paper, we have proposed, along with other commentators, that the city be reconstrued as an ecosystem, a complex adaptive system, which is in a continuous process of changing the humans who live in it as the humans change it in turn, a natural process turned structural coupling. Adopting this perspective is to explicitly recognize that the unit of survival is the organism along with its niche. But in making this shift in perspective, we have also discussed the limitations humans face in grappling with complexity, how our mental models simplify and generate linear causal linkages predicated on heuristics and cognitive biases, and how we are ill-equipped to make informed decisions about sustainable futures. While some of these cognitive limitations are mitigated somewhat by the use of computer technology to run simulations and to test models, we noted that even these can be constrained by the same biases such models seek to overcome, as in the case of the UK government's response being fitted to previous and familiar models of a flu pandemic, despite the data demonstrating a non-flu virus. As a consequence of the foregoing discussion, we surfaced a point of tension. On one hand, we, like others, endorse and advocate the use of in silico simulation and experimentation to explore potential threats and opportunities to build in systemic resilience and redundancy to recover swiftly from such threats. Yet, on the other, we have also recognized that good models are built using good data. But if we are cognitively blind to data because it exceeds the scope of our mental models to conceptualize, or because our ways of being with the world are already shaped through structural coupling with the world we have already changed in such cognitively limited ways, then the quandary is this. What constitutes quantitative data that can be realistically and appropriately abstracted to serve as simulation and modeling inputs for future-proofing cities and urban systems? What data are we to collect to inform our models, even given the aforementioned constraints to knowing?
Sorry, can whoever is speaking mute their microphone, please?
Thanks, Rick. What data are we to collect to inform our models, even given the aforementioned constraints to knowing? How are we going to collect this data for our models and address the ethical issues which may arise? As it turns out, however, this may not be as critical as it first appears. According to one of the originators of system dynamics modeling, Jay Forrester, we first need to model the system and use the system to inform the data to be collected. He continues that for one to design a dynamic simulation model, the factors that must be included arise directly from the questions that are to be answered. In other words, by using models, we can identify the limitations to what we think we know and respond accordingly. This therefore leads us to ask questions such as what we need to ask in order to model a city as a complex adaptive system. The questions asked will determine the models that is constructed, because trivial or vague questions will lead to trivial or vague responses. Not only then is modeling inherently multidisciplinary, but it also leads to the beginnings of a typology of data, comprising data that is already known, data that can yet be captured, data that is needed, and indicative or proxy data. If our purpose is to model a city as a complex adaptive system, then one that satisfies the ambitions of SDG 11, one that can bounce back following the impacts of a pandemic such as COVID-19, one that can influence its future trajectory, then the questions we may consider asking will include the following. What do we need to conserve now in order to change our modus vivendi to facilitate resilience and socioeconomic equality? What do we need to do now to avoid unsustainable futures? What do we need to learn from the future to better inform those policies we vote for, those interests being enshrined in governmental decisions, those products we consume and practices we endorse through our roles as working machines, entangled with technologies and utterances, culture and ecologies in the ongoing processes of becoming other? These are nothing if not questions of ethics, and the decisions we make today determine the options we face downstream. Naturally, these are not the only ways forward, nor the only strategies available. However, if we do wish to lay the groundwork today for a more sustainable tomorrow, then we do need to adopt a long-term view by learning from the future and setting in motion today strategies that will better prepare us for that future. To do so, we do not need smart cities. Rather, we need cognitive cities that adaptively learn, that are agile, and that can bring to bear on future threats a range of pre-tested response strategies within a context that has already built in systemic redundancy to facilitate further adaptations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very thought-provoking presentation there. I've made a few notes of one or two questions and things I want to discuss later on, and I trust other people have too. So we'll leave the questions until the end of the third talk, which finishes at 11 o'clock. And then I hope you'll be able to ask any questions of any of the three speakers, or I think actually the second talk is going to be given by two speakers, which will be an interesting double act. So while Letitia and Birgit are preparing their slides, please just have a think about the things that you'd like to ask Andrew at the end of this morning's session. Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Letitia and or Birgit now.
Thank you, Rick. I hope everybody can see the slides. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, it will be a double act. So thank you very much for coming to our presentation. It's called Transition to Net Zero Cities, and it will be delivered by myself, Leticia Almeida, and by Dr. Birgit Painter, Associate Professor in Smart Cities. And the title may be slightly misleading. It's called Net Zero Cities, which focus on the climate change mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we are trying to give it a more holistic perspective, and it is based on a project that we conducted led by Professor Sobes Bhattacharya, related to the how climate action plans in cities can align better to sustainable development goals. So at the beginning, well, give a little bit of background. So why it's important to focus on cities, followed by some of the findings and insights that we got in this project. So firstly, so why do we focus on cities? Well, firstly, over half of world populations is living in cities. And the cities are drivers of economic growth. They create jobs and they also create infrastructure. but they are also very hungry on resources in terms of energy and also in terms of emissions. So the cities are increasingly responsible for and becoming vulnerable to climate change impacts. And not forgetting the COVID-19, they were also very badly hit in the cities of the densely population. So according to data from the Center of Cities, one of the cities that were hardly hit in the UK were Leicester and Liverpool, with more than 10,000 people cases per 100,000 population. In the US, for example, New York has the highest death toll in the US. So looking slightly into the future, we can expect that into 2050, almost 3/4 of the population will be living in cities, and also a huge increase in demand of energy. So, well, coming back to the greenhouse gas emissions, this slide may look slightly complicated, but the main message, sorry, the slide disappeared.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's try to put it on again. Sorry for this glitch. Okay, so resume. I think that most of the time we associate carbon or greenhouse gas emissions with energy, the energy that we use to produce goods and services, and also the energy that we consume. And you can see that in the intersection of these two circles. But we sometimes do not relate greenhouse gas emissions with our mobility or with the embedded emissions in our buildings or our infrastructure, like in the purple circle. And also most of the times we forget the upstream and downstream emissions related to goods and services that we consume, such as food and clothes. So in that perspective, yes, cities are consumers of resources, but at the same time, greater emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. But the cities, yes, they have been taking action on reducing their emissions. And we can see in this slide that a lot of effort has been conducted in cities related in the building sector, the energy sector, in industry, and in transport. I will not go through the whole series of measures, but yeah, some of you may be very familiar with this type of strategies. However, perhaps more efforts are needed in the way that we can reduce our impact for waste management, for example, through a circular economy principles, so we can reduce, reuse, and recycle. And also improve or increase our green spaces in the cities. Before the pandemic, I think we have taken for granted the green spaces, and nowadays we value because of the benefits that they give us to the physical and mental health. So in well, this particular presentation, we mainly focus in climate action in the Sustainable Development Goal 13, SDG 13. And with both purposes of reducing our emissions, climate mitigation, but also to become more resilient to climate change impact by improving adaptation. And these are quite related to other sustainable development goals, like SDG 7, related with affordable and clean energy for all. Also with SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, in the terms to become more efficient in the use of our resources and manage better our waste management. And also in adaptation, it's quite important that cities become more resilient. So SDG 11 is quite important, related with sustainable cities and communities, also to improve our health with SDG 3, good health and well-being. And also, we must not forget one very valuable resource, which is water. So SDG 6 is quite important as well for clean water and sanitation. However, there is also more interlinkages between the SDGs. If we prepare and implement projects or strategies or policies in a well-thought manner, perhaps it's also feasible to tackle or address other SDGs, such as the SDG 8 related with decent work and economic growth, and also reduce inequalities related with SDG 10. And hopefully it also helps to reduce poverty related with SDG 1. So in summary, all of the SDGs are interlinked. Some of them may have benefits, some of them may have trade-offs. So, but it's important that we consider in a holistic manner. And now I will pass it to Birgit.
Thank you, Letitia. Yes, so Letitia has explained very well all the interlinkages, or some of the interlinkages between the SDGs. And what we wanted to do in a project, we've actually got a project collaboration with the Japanese institute, and in there we wanted to really have a look at how cities deal with this, how cities develop their policies and frame them to kind of respond, or are they responding to SDGs when they frame their climate change plans. So in order to do that, we wanted to look at cities from 2 different countries. And we also realized we really need to develop a framework in order to be able to compare cities, because as you can imagine, it is very difficult. I mean, just seeing all the interlinkages and also then how this is presented in plans and policies and so on, and then how to compare how different cities deal with this. So we need to develop a framework and really kind of look at different cities and their situations and how they deal with really the climate change plans. And of course, part of the project was to develop a network of researchers and good collaboration between cities, between the 2 countries, but also by working with the cities as part of the project, cities can help each other, and we can use them as a kind of examples and sharing good practice. So the project really tried to do that for 2 countries at this point, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. So am I moving on? No, there we go. So the Japanese cities that we chose for the project were Kyoto and Kawasaki. They're very different cities in a way. Everybody's heard of Kyoto, as obviously as the home of the Kyoto Protocol. They're very active in terms of climate change and sustainability development. And whereas Kawasaki is more of an industrial hub, so there's a lot of manufacturing there and so on. Also, Kawasaki is a coastal city as opposed to Kyoto, which is more inland. Both are very large cities, I've got to say as well. So they're 2 good cases for comparison. And obviously with the Japanese partners on the project, they had good insight in how these cities work. So that was another benefit. In terms of the UK cities we looked at Bristol and Nottingham, and you're probably aware that Bristol is very well established as a kind of a leading city in terms of sustainable development, and also in terms of smart cities. They're doing a lot there, and they're very well known for that. Again, we tried to find different cities with different situations. So Bristol is on the west coast, whereas Nottingham is more inland. As you can see, they're much smaller than the Japanese cities, but still provide a good kind of 2 cases for comparison, really. What we needed was really case studies to try our analysis framework. So what we tried to do with these cities then, we wanted to compare, or wanted to see how well their climate change action plans are linked to the SDGs. So we developed a taxonomy of keywords for the different SDGs. So that we'd have literally a table of keywords for each SDG, which we could then see how often the keywords are presented in certain documents. And we decided to focus on the climate change action plans. Obviously, we appreciate there is, every city has numerous policies for different things, and they're all interlinked. But we wanted to focus on the climate change action plans of the cities. So we used NVivo to see how often our keywords that we identified would appear in the climate change plans, and also how much of what percentage of the document the certain text passages covered. So it's not just counting words, it's partly counting words, but then also looking more as how, how much of the document actually focuses on a certain topic or theme. And we use then also to give us a visual representation, just as the first snapshot of how the different cities, what the outcome would be for the different cities. So what you can see on this slide, I know it's a bit small to read probably, certainly it's tiny on my screen, but I will use the colors to explain. So this one is the chart for Kyoto, where basically the rectangles we have on the screen, they represent how often keywords for a certain SDG appeared in the analysis. So we've got the brown one box is the biggest one, is SDG 7, so that's around energy. Then the purple is decent work and economic growth. That's a business kind of SDG. And the green is the third biggest for Kyoto. That's literally climate change action. So that includes mitigation, adaptation, and resilience as the keywords and the themes. So this, we can see what Kyoto focus on, and the other SDGs are covered, appear, or the links there seem to be weaker, but we can look at that in a different way as I go along. So now if we compare Kyoto with Kawasaki, as I said, Kawasaki is the industrial hub. So there's potential that they frame their climate change action quite differently and perhaps linked to different SDGs. But when we look at the chart that we get there, as we can see again, energy, the brown one, and the business focused one, which is the purple one, seem to still be the strongest ones. The other one that's mentioned a lot in Kawasaki is the water, SDG 5, I think, SDG 6, around water. Perhaps that's because they're nearer the coast. But so we can kind of think, well, actually they're doing things quite similarly, but obviously we want to look at it in more detail. Now, what's interesting is when you start comparing more cities. I mean, we're still aware we're only comparing cities in 2 countries. I mean, if you compared cities more widely and certainly a larger number, you probably get lots of different patterns. But we can see that even though we looked at climate change action plans for all cities, for Nottingham and Bristol, the pattern looks a little different. So Nottingham on the left, it has the strongest kind of score. The highest score was for SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities, then followed by energy, and then also the yellow one at the bottom, that is responsible consumption and production. So really looking at the life cycle and including more of the things we often forget that Letitia mentioned around consumption production as well. And the other one that was strong in Nottingham is the blue one, which is partnerships and collaboration. So that's SDG 17. That was quite strong. In Bristol, interestingly, their largest score really was for climate change action. So all around resilience, adaptability and mitigation. Sorry about that. But also then they had a stronger focus after that on business and again on the sustainable cities and communities. But Bristol also, as their 4th strongest score, had the responsible consumption and production. So the patterns look quite different. But as I say, this is a word score, how often a word appears. So what's actually helpful is to look at another way, look at this in another way, and we can look at the percentage of coverage in the document. So it's very similar in terms of the patterns. So you can see here in this bar chart, we have the blue, light and dark blue are the Japanese cities, and the orange and dark orange are the UK cities. So you can see the differences really that we saw with the other patterns in terms of SDG 11, SDG 12, where the focus of sustainable cities and communities is much clearer in the UK documents, and also around responsible consumption and production, whereas the Japanese clearly focus on the affordable clean energy and decent work economic growth. Of course, we're aware it could well be to do with our methodology as well. So so with our methodology, because you know, when you're looking at word matches in different languages, that could have an effect. So perhaps we need to look again, also just to double check we have used appropriate keywords for our comparison. But it does interestingly show us that some of the SDGs, like SDG 1, poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, even aspects around well-being, so SDG 3, gender equality in education, are not mentioned so much. Also peace, justice on the other side, SDG 7, SDG 16, SDG 15, life on land. So there's some SDGs that are not mentioned much by all of the cities. So this is really interesting when we're starting to think about the COVID response, because actually in terms of responding to COVID, lots of these things are very important to consider and to integrate in city strategies. So of course we looked in this project at climate change and climate change action linked to SDGs, but in terms of COVID, I think we need to look at the interlinkages even more widely. And this is actually part of a project proposal we're just putting together. So to use this approach, or see how we can use this approach to really look at, you know, even not just interlinkages between climate change and climate change action and SDGs, but also linking it to COVID response. But one thing that really came out of this analysis, we really see it as a snapshot that allows us to compare cities, hopefully more cities in the future. But, you know, I'm sure all of you looking at this chart going, why is that different? And what are the differences? So actually we need to, you know, engage with the cities and find out in more detail. That's what Letitia is going to tell you a bit more about the next step that we did for that.
Thank you, Birgit. Yes. We try to understand better, well, in this past project, what are the opportunities and challenges that the cities may have to integrate the SDGs in the climate action plans. So we developed a survey that we distributed around July and September 2020. We sent it to around 40 local authorities and also local government association networks. And unfortunately, we didn't have a good response rate. We only received 8 responses. And it was not surprising. Even the local government association was saying that due to the COVID issues, the local authorities were very busy and they trying to address very important issues in the city, such as public health, housing, etc. So we are grateful for the 8 participants that responded our survey. But despite it was a low response, I think that there was very good insights of the responses. We can see that we have, in the pie charts, that we have responses from unitary authorities. We also have from county and district councils, and also one from a London borough. And in terms of location, geographical location, there was also kind of balance. There were more responses in the East and West Midlands, but we also have responses in the north and south of the UK. So yes, firstly related with the enabling factors and barriers for local climate action, we'll first explain the chart. You can see at the bottom of the figure, we use a Likert scale from 1 to substantial obstacle, to 5 a substantial enable. So the ones that are green, we consider them as enabling factors. The ones in yellow is not an enabler, neither an obstacle, and then ones in red are considered as obstacles. So we see the enabling factors. One of the things that they were responding is that there was high local political will in decision making. And we think perhaps this is not surprising. A lot of local authorities last year or previous years, they joined the climate emergencies. There was also mention about the information available. That was not a problem. It's enabled. I think they have enough and robust models and tools that they can use related with, particularly I think with the monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions. And also They have conducted a lot of work over the years with engaging with communities, with housing associations, with the schools, with businesses, including also universities. Now let's look at also at the barriers, the red ones. So, well, I think also not surprising, and perhaps a lot of large institutions are facing this type of problems. There are conflict with budget priorities. Well, it was a question about conflict or convergence, but because it's red, it's more like a conflict. Also, the staff time availability. If you can see two bars, the staff availability and the staff expertise, there is no problem with the knowledge that the council, the staff have. They have increased their knowledge and the skill related with climate mitigation and climate adaptation, but perhaps it's the amount of projects that they have less time availability. And at the top of the graph, we can see whether it was action or inaction of the central government. It has seen more as an inaction, as a barrier, perhaps also because of the hindering or certain policies that previously was supporting more strongly the reduction of emissions or the adaptation. So, well, this is when we ask them about the local climate action plans. And then we also ask about the opportunities and challenges for integrating SDGs in the local climate action plans. So again, the green ones, the opportunities, the red are the challenges, and the yellow are the neutrals. So some of the issues that they think as opportunities are the co-benefits that through climate mitigation and adaptation, you can, and also including integrating the SDGs, is the co-benefits may have an enhanced impact or it can be delivered at lower costs. They also see the interlinkages and synergies of the SDGs as an opportunity. However, in the red side, it's also, they can also, I think, sometimes struggle with the complexity of the targets and goals of the SDGs. I think, well, in a neutral basis, the communication with different departments of the council is not seen as a major problem, but it's quite important that in the integration of SDGs, the departments doesn't work like silos. They can be working together toward the same goals. They have been involving stakeholders for the climate action plans, so bringing them to the SDGs shouldn't be that difficult. And they also have available data about the local environmental, social, and economic data. However, we also ask them how much or to what extent they have start implementing or monitoring activities related with the SDGs, and all of them were in red. That's why it was not, well, there was no point of putting a red graph. But some of the most salient issues was that they still need to include the SDGs in their local policy frameworks. And also, even they have the data, they have to develop a set of indicators, localized indicators for SDGs, and then start collecting and monitoring. And in contrast to what happened with climate action.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes, we are finishing very soon. I'm sorry, we extended a little bit. So yes, there is a need of more awareness and communication campaigns related with SDGs. And now we pass it over to Birgit. Birgit, you are mute.
I'll try and quickly summarize, lost another few seconds there. Basically, you know, what we've found, and probably doesn't surprise you, SDG integration can take many forms. The text analysis we've used provides a snapshot, but clearly we need to delve deeper, and you know, the analysis that Letitia showed you shows how different cities deal with it, what their barriers are, and actually that shows that cities might actually be able to learn from this. So if we find how different cities deal with the situation, what their strategies are, what works well, especially looking at successful cities like Kyoto, Bristol, and so on. Other cities can learn from that. But really, the main thing is that adapting action plans to local situations is crucial, using the challenges. And in terms of the COVID response, this will be even more so, because cities have different strengths, different weaknesses, and so they really need to tailor their policies. And it's difficult to for them to really present all those interlinkages in a coherent, easy to understand way sometimes. They have lots of policies, and which documents do people read, which documents are used. It's quite interesting and challenging. And this conclusion here for the net zero, in terms of net zero, was energy is one part of cities' climate action, but so will be resilience. And I think resilience will stretch over multiple SDGs, more so than energy potentially, actually. So it's a bigger challenge. But with actually preparing to respond to climate change, cities already are looking at the holistic picture increasingly. So this was another kind of cartoon that Letitia found, really shows the challenge. It's not just one wave that's hitting us, it's multiple that are building up, with climate change being perhaps the slowest. And sometimes we forget about it because we're dealing with the other waves first, but actually it's the biggest wave. So I don't know whether Letitia wants to say anything at the end, but otherwise we welcome your questions.
Thank you, Birgit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birgit and Letitia. That was very thought-provoking, and I love the cartoons, particularly the one at the end. In the interest of time, can I just say quickly before we hand over to Ayodele, that you will have noticed there are some questions in the chat, and also that some people have started giving a thumbs up to questions that they like in the chat. That seems like quite a good use of time. So if there are questions there that you would also like to see asked at the end of Ayodele's session, please give the thumbs up to those questions. If you don't like any of them, add your own question, and I will prioritize the ones with the most thumbs, first of all. Okay, and with that, I'll hand over to Ayodele Asekome. I hope I've said that correctly, and look forward to your talk about North East Scotland. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Good morning, everyone. You got the pronunciation of my name correctly, so not a problem at all. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for putting this together. It's a good opportunity to meet with researchers working in this space. Hopefully, I'll be able to provide another perspective on this discussion, especially in relation to the theme for this year's conference. So I'll just quickly try and share my screen now, and we'll get cracking. Can you please confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Good. So the project that I'm looking at is still at a conceptual phase. So it's all still very conceptual. And the topic is Northeast Scotland as the energy transition frontier caught between and betwixt, navigating the multi-stakeholder and climate governance issues. So I'm going to run through this very quickly. Like I said, it's very conceptual just now, but hopefully I can get feedback on how to take the work forward. I'll be providing a quick introduction in terms of the context of this issue. I'll look at the aim and objective of the study. I'll provide a very, very short literature review, and then I'll look at the methodology, which is not too different from what the previous presenters have showed us in terms of content analysis. And then we'll look at some of the preliminary results, which will probably drive how I take this inquiry forward. Now, what I wanted to do at the onset of this study was to examine the multi-stakeholder and climate governance issues and roles, and the challenges of choosing between different pathways to recovery from COVID-19. As we all know, we can approach this subject in different ways. We could look to go very quickly and simply just run some of the systems that we have in place to bounce back, so to speak. So we continue burning fossil fuels, or we use what is considered to be the ideal way of going forward, which is to seek for a transition to renewables. And also, I wanted to explore how the Sustainable Development Goals, targets, and outcomes could provide a way of getting stakeholders to arrive at a consensus or come to a common ground as to how to proceed, given the difficulties or given the challenges that we're presented with. So the context really is very, very clear and very obvious to us. Again, the previous discussants and presenters have highlighted the fact that COVID-19 threw us a curveball that meant that some of the things that we did not envisage, or some of the things that we now know arising from COVID-19, probably prepares us to view climate change issues differently, or to approach the subject differently. For the northeast of Scotland, it was the case that the oil and gas industry was experiencing dwindling fortunes, and so there was the framework of funding and policy instruments referred to as maximizing economic recovery, which was at that time intended to stimulate activities in the oil and gas industry. But of course, the industry is known to be a contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so the dwindling fortunes of the industry also meant that the stakeholders needed to start thinking of how to transition the region to a low carbon or energy transition hub, focusing on renewables. And in this respect, the plans and the efforts that have been made so far have received quite a lot of support. The United Kingdom government, for instance, provided a backing to the tune of £27 million for the creation of an energy transition zone. The Scottish government also matched that funding with £62 million of funding in the Energy Transition Fund. However, we also see what looks like a conflict of policies here, or what people might term to be inimical to achieving net zero by the UK government putting in place the North Sea transition deal. Again, as the name implies, it's a transition deal which is intended to transition the oil and gas industry to a renewable or sustainable industry, to retain jobs and expertise, or to transition people from the oil and gas industry roles into renewable energy positions, or retain societal cohesion and maintain, as it were, the fabric of society in a sustainable way. However, the North Sea transition deal does not rule out the issuance of new oil prospecting licenses. So commenters or people are viewing this as a way of trying to recover from COVID-19 using fossil fuels if there is no restriction on licenses. There's no guarantees that new licenses will not be renewed. The opponents of this scheme are asking how we can achieve net zero if we're still going to be producing more fossil fuel. So that is the context from which I'm looking at this. And there's that difference, the differences between different stakeholders and what their expectations are in terms of how to come out of the COVID recession. Now, again, by way of background here, we can look at the carbon footprint of Scotland, where we see over the years a decline in greenhouse gas emission. Of course, the data presented here is up to 2018, which is the data that's available on the Scottish government website. Between 2018 and as we speak, we now have evidence to clearly see that there is a connection between industrial activity and human activities, and climate change. So you would expect that the level of decline of greenhouse gas emission would need to be much more rapid and need to be sustained for us to be able to get to zero carbon at the net zero carbon at the set date of 2045 for Scotland or 2050 for the United Kingdom. Now, again, we can break down that information there. We see that as far as Scotland is concerned, energy supply has been the area where a lot of gains have been made in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. But there's still a lot of room for reduction in areas like transportation, business activities, and residential emissions. So these are all areas that gains can be made in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases. Now, the way to situate the discussion really is to look at it from the literature on multilateralism, in which climate change agreements and governance discussions is viewed from the inputs of stakeholders at different levels. We typically talk about a top-down or bottom-up climate governance interactions. But increasingly, we're beginning to see hybrid approaches where different stakeholder groups come together and collaborate or cooperate to achieve a common goal. And so in this discussion, the typical stakeholder groups that we can identify are the state or sub-state actors. So in the case of Northeast Scotland, we're looking at the Scottish government, we're looking at the Aberdeen City Council, we're looking at sub-state actors that are contributing to the effort of reducing carbon footprint. Now we also have private sector actors or businesses, and then civil society. Of course, we can decompose these main groups into sub-stakeholder groups, but for the purpose of this review, I simply looked at these three broad headings. Also, the literature talks about stakeholder roles, quite a few roles that I identified, especially in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. Cooper 2008 identified several roles that non-state actors played to formulating the Paris Agreement. So we have roles like orchestration, negotiation, regulation, partnerships, private governance, activist efforts, and so on and so forth. And increasingly, we're talking about the role of stakeholders in terms of promoting justice, providing legitimacy, and promoting effectiveness. So what I did in this exploratory study basically was to take the 3 stakeholder categories and the 9 stakeholder roles, and to use NVivo, just like in the previous paper, to look at how the stakeholders are aligning themselves or positioning themselves in relation to how to come out of the COVID-19 recession. So again, there are quite a few documents that we can look at here, but I used a set of search terms to narrow it down to some specific documents. So I was particular about documents referring to these specific terms that are displayed on the screen. So there were 159 such documents focusing on those activities in the northeast of Scotland. Now, what I did looking at these documents and the web pages was to create a 4-grid matrix where stakeholders could seek to promote a slow recovery that is energized by fossil fuel, which is the status quo, which is where we currently are, or to seek for a fast recovery that is energized by fossil fuel. This is an expedient approach where we burn more fossil fuel to quickly come out of the recession. Alternatively, we could adopt a slow recovery and gradually build on your renewable energy model. Or alternatively, we could pursue a fast recovery that is energized by renewables. So the expedient grid, the trade-off grid, the ideal grid. So we'll be able to categorize what position stakeholders took in relation to the issues around putting in place a scheme of work or program or framework to come out of the COVID-19 recession. And so, like I said, this is still very, exploratory. And what I was looking to test by this process was to consider how stakeholders position themselves in relation to how we come out of the recession. And I proposed that stakeholders will take positions that are in line with their dominant stakeholder roles. They're able to push for a particular point of view, given that their stakeholder role allows them to push for that position. And also, I'm trying to explore the way that the Sustainable Development Goals can be used to achieve coalescence of preferences. In other words, achieving consensus as to how to proceed. Now, this scheme really looks at the number of documents. The coding was such that we could look at how stakeholders used their stakeholder role to push for alignment with a particular position. Now, I presented the information for each stakeholder group separately. So for the public sector, they typically use the orchestration instrument. And in the recent discussion and the documents that I was able to come across, the focus appears to be on approaching the recovery in a fast manner using renewables. Now, the public sector is also open to negotiation, which from the way the arguments are presented, looks like they are open to a form of recovery that uses fossil fuels within limits, but ultimately pushes for recovery that is sustained by renewable energy. Now, by means of regulation, the public sector stakeholder group looks like they are looking for a quick recovery driven by fossil fuel. And that is why we can see the UK government announcing a package of incentive for the oil industry, the North Sea transition deal, to the tune of 16 billion pounds. It looks like there is a leeway there to use fossil fuel to hasten the recovery. So again, these are just the preliminary results. The sizes of the cycles there represents the frequency in the document that I looked at, the frequency of reference of the documents to these elements of stakeholder engagement. Now, for the private sector, it's quite a mixed picture here, depending on the type of private sector actor. But mostly, the private sector actors were looking to push for a fast recovery through partnerships. So in the North Sea, for instance, you see entities like the Net Zero Transition Company, which is a coalition of private sector actors that are promoting fast recovery using renewable energy. Now they are also positioning themselves to look like responsible companies, which talks about legitimacy. So they are aligning themselves with this ideal approach to recovery from the recession as a way of legitimizing their own activities. In terms of private governance, there is a slight difference between how the traditional oil and gas companies, energy companies, look at this recovery and the new startups in renewables. The new startups are all up for a fast recovery. The oil and gas companies are looking for the possibility of gradually transiting to renewables as we recover from the recession. And finally, civil society is mostly aligned to a fast recovery, but civil society groups are also aware of the disruptive effect that a fast transition could have, and so they are open to negotiation as well, where you know, a civil society group like Greenpeace is clearly against the North Sea transition deal, whereas other civil societies are aware that there is a need for action in terms of addressing climate change as we recover from COVID-19. Now, the final bit, which again, like I said, this is all still in the conceptualization phase. I'm trying to see how, instead of looking at this issue from this individual stakeholder views, we can make recourse to the Sustainable Development Goals, which had been agreed through a multilateral process as a means of driving cooperation or collaboration. So specifically in this discussion, we could look to SDG 7, SDG 11 and SDG 13, where the targets and the outputs, the outcomes would be linked to the national plan framework for Scotland, and then used to synthesize or cascade downwards to the local authority level or to the Northeast region level, specific actions or intervention actions that would ensure that we have a quick recovery driven by renewables. So that is the point I would stop. I do not as yet have a conclusion because this is still an ongoing piece of work, and I'm open to ideas and suggestions and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ayodele. Very interesting stuff. Okay, so you've probably all seen some text being typed in the chat there, various people asking questions for all of our speakers, and other people adding their thumbs up to some of those questions. I think what we'll do is just have a couple of minutes for anybody that wants to type anything into the chat to do so before I start going through those and asking some of our speakers the most popular questions. Okay, well, I think we'll go from the top. There is a question here from Abhishek Tiwari for Andrew Mitchell. Abhi asks, he says, I like your idea of learning from the future. My main worry is the COVID-19 shows that models are incapable of capturing high impact, low probability events. What's your handle on this? Andrew, if you'd like to have a think about the question and give us your answer.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Abby. It's a good question, and of course I don't have a definitive answer to it. What I would suggest, though, is one of the things that I think we need to do, and I'm not a modeler, so I'm speaking probably out of turn, but one of the things that I think is critical for modelers and policymakers, for that matter, to engage in is to be mindful of the limits to our cognitive capacities, to be aware of our blind spots, the heuristics we use, the shortcuts, etc., and to take these into account wherever possible. What this would also mean is that in designing particular models, that it's probably wise, and this is certainly the benefit of using kind of in silico models, because you can experiment and reverse the experiment and rerun it with different parameters, is to be able to look at extending the range of possibility or the range of probability, if you will, so that we can start incorporating and taking into account so-called black swan events, even though they may be very low probability of occurrence. Certainly, if they have high impact, they're worth looking at. it's not a particularly satisfactory answer, and I'd certainly be interested to hear somebody who's got it cracked. But certainly that's my off-the-cuff response to that question.
Thank you, Andrew. Another question now from Mark Lemon, which is similar in some ways to a question that I asked as well for Birgit and Letitia. Mark's question is, would you expect similar findings in terms of SDG weightings from community stakeholders to those from local authorities? And my question was similar to that one, because I wanted to ask whether there was any evidence that devolution of power away from central government to lower levels in the decision chain has any impact at all on sustainability. So if I can ask Letitia or Birgit to talk for a second on the appropriate level for decisions to be taken and the effect on the SDGs.
Sorry, Birgit, I can perhaps answer your question about the devolution of power. I think that, well, we don't have a strong evidence on if that devolution can be connected to sustainability. But I think that the local authorities still rely on national policies, or well, not subsidies, but like the feed-in tariffs or the Green Deal or those kind of policies. However, what we are looking, when we are looking at more detail, is that localization is really important. Different cities have different priorities, where the location or the economy, the income in the city. So I think that one size doesn't fit all. So the devolution, there is no clear answer whether the devolution has helped or not in the sustainability, but localization is very important. I don't know if you want to add something, Birgit.
Yeah, I fully agree that cities, they have to juggle this. What money can we get from government? Where is the support going? The government comes up with frameworks and so on. They're trying to fit in and get the funding, or also sticking to local government policies and kind of almost watching what's happening and then reacting while they also know what works for their area. So balancing the two things is, I think, very challenging in some ways, but they're definitely always looking after the local kind of benefits, and also they know the strengths better. So I think the devolution does help because it gives them a little bit more freedom, but at the same time they're still very dependent on what the government is doing. So that would be my take on it.
Yeah, and also, well, in terms of the question from Mark about, I think that our research was a little bit limited in the sense that we were using mainly climate action plans, documents from the city council, and also the survey was very focused on city council staff. So I think that, yeah, the answers will be different in both cases if we look for community plans instead of the city council plans, and also if we ask the survey to stakeholders, different stakeholders. So I think in that sense it's a little bit biased towards the council responses.
Yeah, I think it'd be very interesting actually to make that link between what the council does and what the people want, almost, I'm sure it'd be different, but also sometimes I think that is the council are doing lots of things, but people might not be aware or fully understand what's going on. It might be communication issues, or sometimes we're just not interested in what's going on. We just then dip in and out, don't we? So I think it'd be very interesting. You probably get very strong community groups with strong opinions if you if you try to do that. But it's a very interesting question. I agree.
Thank you both. That was great. So we have a question from Andrew to you both again. Methodologically, how did you deal with or account for the use of synonyms and indirect references when searching for keywords? This can often be a challenge in text mining analytics, so I'm curious how you worked with this.
Shall I answer, Letitia? So have a go. Fully agree. And that was one of the things we definitely came across and struggled with when we developed a list of keywords. And I'm sure there's a lot more research actually, or lots more tinkering with the approach that needs to be done. The challenge we had was not just finding the right keywords for, say, in English, but actually then having something that also works in Japanese. And I'm not entirely sure we've got it all right, because we ended up, because we wanted to compare in two different languages, we actually wanted to keep it very simple. because you could have, for every keyword you come up with in the UK, then have synonyms or whatever. But then in Japanese, it's, I don't even know. Okay, so it's very difficult to actually figure that out, and I fully agree. I tried, actually, while I was running the analysis, I did try different synonyms, especially when I remember looking at the gender question. So we didn't know what keywords to use for gender, because we just put gender in and nothing comes up. Does that mean it's not covered? So we then looked at boy, girl, man, woman, all these different things. We looked at different ones, but the ones where I looked at different keywords, it doesn't really change the results in the end. So I'm not saying I looked at everything but yeah, it's a very good question. And for the next, if we're doing for the next proposal that we're looking at, we need to look at that in more detail.
Thank you both. Good answers. So we have a question now from me, actually, which has a couple of thumbs. Always nice to see. There's a question for Ayodele. So to what extent is the oil and gas industry behind the big and, in my view, regrettable push to use hydrogen for space heating and transport?
Yes, that's a very, very good question, and a very valid one in terms of the current dynamics. And it's really that aspect of legitimacy that I was talking about, where they are doing some of those things to kind of gain the legitimacy to continue to run their businesses, and they're approaching it in different ways and with different levels of success in that respect. So that issue of legitimacy is one that to me is very significant when we look at what the oil companies are doing. But the technology is